Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hey everybody, Pete Greco with Productive Corporation here, joined by my good friend Mark LaLiberty from Watchguard, who's a senior security analyst, who's going to be telling us all kinds of cool and potentially scary stuff. So put on your seatbelts and get ready to ride with us. We're going to talk about meeting productive in 1 minute. As promised, it'll take 1 minute or less, and then we're going to jump right into the action with Mark. We're going to talk about actions of threat actors, lessons from the SolarWinds hack, and if you haven't heard about that, you're in for some exciting news. The ever-popular booby trap, I can't wait to hear about that myself, as well as some threat stats, and this is going to be a great informational session to get you thinking about what else you need to do in your security environment. So without further ado, meet productive in 1 minute. Who are these guys? Security solutions for mid-sized organizations for the past 20 years. This month, actually, celebrating our 20th birthday. I've been here the whole time. We offer you specialized expertise to help you with technical and licensing questions. We do vulnerability assessments, implementation, optimizations, Active Directory security, Office 365 security, all kinds of great stuff to help you stay safe and secure. We also offer relative third-party content and critiquing of active security solutions, security issues, and security needs. Feel free to check out our YouTube channel. And you can reach out to us, help@productivecorp.com, call our direct number, reach out to your Productive Corp account executive. Let us know how we can help you. All right, without any further ado, we're going to turn it over to Mark and let him deliver the meat of this presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much. If I'd known it was your birthday, I would have brought a cake.
Yeah, there you go. I would eat that cake, I'll tell you. My go-to webinar console is locked up. Mark, give me 1 second to turn the presentation over to you.
No worries. The presentation gods seem to be angry today, I guess.
Yeah, I guess so. There we go. Okay. You should see a little screen pop up right now.
Here we go.
Excellent.
Point and show.
Boom.
And let's get rolling.
We got you.
Awesome. So thanks again for the intro. Really excited to be here. Like you mentioned, today we're going to be talking about cyber threat landscape. We'll go over a few key findings from our latest internet security report from the Watchguard Threat Lab and some overall threat landscape statistics as well. And then, of course, we'll end by giving some tips on how to defend yourselves against the latest cyber threats. Before we start, though, real quick about me. I've been at Watchguard for about 9 years now. I think my 9-year anniversary is actually tomorrow. I've been in a few different roles and responsibilities, but now I manage the Watchguard Threat Lab, which is our team of researchers who our day-to-day job is basically to keep the pulse of the cyber threat landscape. We try and figure out what the latest tools and techniques are that the threat actors are using through our own threat intelligence and from third-party feeds. We take that, turn it around, and put out daily blog posts, research articles, podcasts, and of course presentations and our quarterly security report, just to give you a good idea of what the cyber threat actors are doing and how to defend your networks. I come from a lifetime of traditional hacking, so that was growing up and ripping apart every electronics device that my parents brought home. Not always putting them all back together, but still learning a lot along the way. But my main specialties now are in network security, so obviously working at Watchguard, and really my big passion is IoT. I love going and buying the latest internet-connected doodad from Amazon and then trying to find vulnerabilities in it and working with manufacturers to get those resolved as well, with quite a bit of success too. So again, agenda for today, we'll go over some threat landscape statistics and some trends from the latest internet security report. If you don't stick around to the link at the end, you can always get a copy of that report at watchguard.com/security report. Definitely check that out. Then we'll roll into a look at the top 3 cyber threats to watch out for the coming year. so specific techniques that the attackers are using, and then we'll end up with how to defend against those threats. So for time's sake, let's go ahead and hop on with a look at the threat landscape. And before we get rolling, I've got a bit of a self-reflection quiz for you guys. I want you to think about how long do you think it takes on average for an organization to identify that they've been the victim of a breach? Do you think it's 7 hours, 7 days, 7 weeks, or 7 months? So this is from the point where an infection happens or an incident occurs to the point where the average organization across the world realizes that they've been the victim of a breach. And if we look at the data from the latest Poneman Institute data breach investigations report, we actually find that mean time to identify, so the time it takes to identify a breach has occurred on your network, globally was 207 days. So we're talking around 7 months or so from the point of infection to when you notice that malicious activity on your network. And even after that, the mean time to contain, so the time it takes to clean up after the fact, was 73 days. So globally, it takes organizations an average of 9 to 10 months from the point of infection to the point of identifying and cleaning up the mess. And throughout that time, the threat actors are doing a lot. Usually, they don't go after your biggest crown jewels first. They're going to go after whatever the weakest system is on your network and then move on from there. So during that time, they're identifying what your most vulnerable systems are. Maybe they're figuring out what backup solution you're using and getting credentials for that. They're elevating their access by stealing hashes off of the network or phishing your own employees. And then they can use those credentials to then phish your other employees or phish partners or customers you work with, and basically set it all up so they can have a big final coup de grace of maybe ransomware deployed simultaneously to all your systems while also deleting your backups. Or maybe just setting up crypto miners on your most valuable resources to use your own computer resources to mine cryptocurrency for them. A great example of an incident that took a long time to identify was actually the SolarWinds breach from just last year. We can look at SolarWinds timeline that they put out in one of their publications after the fact. You can see the attack actually started back in September of last year. September 4th was the first instance of the threat actors gaining access to SolarWinds. And for about 2 months there, they were testing their access. So any point in that time, they could have potentially noticed anomalies and login attempts, maybe coming from unknown or unexpected sources, or suspicious activity on their network. Then there was 4 months where the threat actors had actually injected malware on the build servers for the SolarWinds Orion platform. And that malware was incredibly sophisticated. It's easy for us to say, hey, you should have known this or noticed it sometime in this period, SolarWinds, but in reality, the threat actors knew exactly what they were doing. Like this malware they were using to ultimately insert their backdoor into SolarWinds' own products even had error correction methods to clean up after itself if something went wrong, so that it would leave behind as few artifacts as possible for a developer to notice and investigate. They even cleaned up after themselves and removed that malware 4 months after the fact, once they had inserted all the backdoors, so that it would be even more difficult to detect them. Which means that now 9 months from the point of infection to the point where, or from where they started inserting the malware to when people finally noticed that there was an issue. And really, this breach was only discovered after the threat actors used their backdoor access to go after one of the largest security companies in the world, at FireEye, which triggered them to investigate and find the source of it. Like, this is a prime example of just how sophisticated some of these attacks can be and how difficult it can be for even tech companies and big security companies to identify them. And one of the reasons that it's so difficult to block and detect these threats is that malware that the threat actors are using these days are becoming even more evasive than ever. One of the numbers that we track in our quarterly internet security report and every day on our threat landscape page is this number called the 0-day malware number. And for the tech folks out there, this is different than a 0-day exploit, which is an exploit against a unpatched vulnerability. When we're talking about 0-day malware, we're saying malware that gets past signature-based antivirus, meaning it doesn't have a signature, or the threat actor used some form of obfuscation to get it past signature-based detections. And these days, that's easier than ever. I could go on an underground forum, not even on the dark web, just on the regular old internet, just a boring old hacking forum, and find all sorts of things called packers and cryptors available for free that do a really good job of taking even really old malware payloads and allowing them to evade traditional signature-based defenses. So for the last month, I just pulled this yesterday, that zero-day malware number was right around 57%. And what this means to you is that if you're relying just on a single layer of protection when it comes to anti-malware, just traditional signature-based anti-malware services, you're missing over half of all malware that's out there. And if you were to set up your defenses and say, oh, it'll only catch half of it, that's not good enough. And this is a great example of why you need multiple layers of advanced malware protection in order to catch these modern threats. Now, in our latest report, we were actually able to get a hold of data from the endpoint now. For previous WatchGuard customers or folks that have followed the WatchGuard Threat Lab, you've known that for the last 4 years or so, our report's been based entirely on perimeter-based detections because that's where we mostly live with our security services. But thanks to the recent Panda acquisition last year, we've been able now to look beyond the perimeter and onto the endpoint itself. And one of the things that we tracked throughout the course of last year and the previous years, thanks to this data, was the growth in different infection methods for malware. So this means when a malware infection occurs on a computer, so when a crypto miner is discovered, or maybe a backdoor Trojan or ransomware is discovered, they all start somewhere. And that could be through a malicious Office document. It could be through an exploit of a web browser or a browser extension. It could be attacks against frameworks like Java or Adobe, or it could be threats like that start with scripts, so living off the land attacks. And these script-based threats are becoming ever more prevalent year after year. This graph we have right here is actually on a logarithmic scale, because if we switch this to a linear scale, you see just how massive the growth in living off the land attacks using scripting engines is. And the majority of these come in through email attachments, from phishing attachments, where maybe it's an Office document that launches PowerShell, or it could be just a straight up PowerShell script or JavaScript or VB script file that the threat actor convinces their victim into downloading and running. And as soon as you run that file, the threat actor doesn't care what happens to it. You can delete it. You can have your traditional endpoint protection identify it and block it, because at that point, they've already gone straight into memory, loaded up different modules using things like PowerShell and PowerSploit framework and Cobalt Strike to go out and grab payloads and inject them straight into memory and execute them from there. These fileless-based threats are growing so much largely because they are so effective at evading traditional endpoint protections as well. It's another great reason why you need tools that not only just scan new files as they're saved to the hard drive, but monitor existing processes to look for suspicious behavior. So that way, if notepad.exe starts enumerating your file system and spinning up Windows crypto libraries, you can set off some red flags that maybe someone injected a ransomware payload into that application. So now let's move on to the top cyber threats to watch out for in the coming year. And the first one is a bit of a gimme. It should be obvious to just about everyone, and that's spear phishing. So phishing's been around for quite some time, actually. Everyone probably remembers back in the 90s and early 2000s when you'd get those messages from a Nigerian prince saying, if you pay my my bail money to get me out of jail or get me out of the country, I'll give you half of my riches. The good news is our users, our end users, us, we're all getting really good at realizing that those style of phishing emails are bogus. Even just the dragnet style phishing emails of, hey, here's your shipping confirmation from UPS, we're getting better at detecting those and realizing they're fake and not falling for them. And that means that the threat actors are having to get a lot more crafty with how they create these phishing messages. So they're going more towards automated social network recon now, where they'll figure out who you work for, who you work with, who your friends and family are. They'll figure out your organization mapping within your company, who your partners are, who your customers are, what vendors you work with. Then they'll use brand impersonation and create these really believable targeted spear phishing messages towards specific individuals or organization groups within a company. And because they have all this information, even sometimes mannerisms of what your communication looks like, it makes them really believable. And it means that companies are falling for these. Like 90 to 95% of breaches start with a spear phish. Interestingly enough, the majority of them don't actually use links. They use files still. That means even though we've trained our users not to trust attachments, a lot of people are still falling for them, largely because they don't think of a Word document as something that's going to suddenly cause a remote access Trojan to pop up on their computer, and they're falling for it. If we look at some of these more recent phishes, we can see just how crafty the threat actors are getting in hiding their tracks too. Like this is a relatively recent phish that we detected as part of our DNS Watch DNS firewalling service, where some recipients were getting email messages saying, I've got a file to share with you on OneDrive. Click here. And if you click on that link, it actually has the email address of the recipient baked into the link, so that when you pop up on this page, it'll be pre-populated with their email to give it a little more credibility. Looks like an Office 365 login. Maybe I had an active session that I just need to click and re-enter my password in order to authenticate. Most frighteningly, though, this was actually hosted on a valid Microsoft-owned domain, windows.net. Because with a lot of these cloud-based hosting services like AWS or Azure or the Google Cloud, they let you register your own subdomains for some of their content distribution networks or just cloud storage services. So in this case, the threat actor registered Service Manager 00 off of the Azure Cloud Storage Service and hosted whatever they wanted. So in this case, a website that looks like an Office 365 phish. And this is pretty much par for the course. We see this a lot now, where threat actors are abusing these cloud hosting services because some of the best advice we used to give previously was, oh, hover over the link, and if it looks like it's legitimate, it's probably safe. But these days, that's not good enough anymore. Just because the link looks like it's going to Microsoft.com or Windows.net doesn't mean that it is inherently safe on its own. And you still need to treat it with skepticism and suspicion, or else you're going to fall for a phish like this. Unfortunately, the threat actors are also getting a lot better with their hooks too. They use timely things like the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, to prey on people's fears and uncertainties and doubts in order to lower the tipping point of getting someone to bite onto a phish. Another one that we saw starting around mid-time last year were these messages claiming to come from the United Nations with small business relief in the form of grants and loans. And if you clicked on the message, it said, click here to see your grant or your loan from the United Nations, which you can imagine, like, you guys know the best. Small businesses were hurting for much of the last year. And if you saw something like this, where maybe you could get something to help keep the doors open, you'd be pretty willing to look past some of the obvious signs that this was a phish and potentially fall for it. And if you clicked on it, it just asks you to log into your email account to get started. And now the threat actor has a copy of your username and password, and they have access to your full account. When it comes to some of the file phishes that we saw instead of links, we've seen a lot of threats that fall under this category. It's called abracadabra, is one of the signatures we use to catch it. I don't know where that comes from, honestly. It's kind of a silly name, but it is what it is. But this caches a really common class of phishing hooks that we've seen, where they come in the form of a password-protected Excel spreadsheet. So threat actors use password protection because it encrypts the file, which means that antivirus engines can't scan it to look for something bad. And you can't, in general, just straight up block them, because a lot of people use password encryption to protect sensitive information. But in general, with a password-protected file, it adds an additional step to the potential victim, where now you have to convince them to not only click the file, but also enter in a password. Unless you're using this method that we started seeing the threat actors use, where they actually encrypted the file with the default password for Microsoft Office, which is Velvet Sweatshop. Again, I have no idea why they chose that. It is what it is. But it turns out that if you encrypt it with that, the file is still encrypted, which makes it more difficult for anti-malware engines to scan it and look for anomalies. But if you open that file in Excel, it will automatically try that default password before prompting the user for anything. So in this case, it automatically decrypts it and runs it. For this particular file, it contained VBA scripts that were used to download another loader. I believe it was Cobalt Strike, and then use that to download an actual Trojan, inject that into memory, and run it from there. When it comes to other phishes, one of the things we track in our reports are malicious domains that individuals are most commonly falling for. I guess that's not the end of it. We also track domains that malware connections might be beaconing out to. I will go ahead and say, if you don't see that little note at the bottom of here, do not visit these domains. They are all malicious in one form or another. But you'll notice a couple interesting trends in here. Like, for example, under the phishing domains, there's a subdomain of SharePoint. And again, that's really common. This is the first time I've actually seen only one of them in the top 10 list. Generally, we see 3 or 4, because it's a really good way for threat actors to piggyback off of the good reputation of SharePoint.com and host their phishing attacks that way. Over under the malware section, an interesting one that actually wasn't new for this quarter, but one I still want to point out, is right in the middle there, talknowall.com. That's actually the second stage command and control domain for the VPN filter malware from about 2 years ago now. If you missed the news on that, it was a really widespread malware attack that went after consumer routers and consumer network equipment. Think like the Netgear or the Asus router you'd buy at Best Buy, or maybe your Western Digital MyBook network attached storage you have. And once this malware gained a hold of a system, it would beacon out to this command and control domain to download additional malware payloads onto that host. Microsoft actually helped take down the infrastructure for this, so the botnet is no longer active, or at least growing, but there's still a massive number of infected devices out there. We had over almost 9,000 beacons out to this domain over Q4 alone. And that's because it's really difficult, once someone has infected an IoT device or a consumer-grade networking appliance, to identify that infection and clean it up if you aren't specifically looking for it. This is why we need to take extra special care when it comes to deploying IoT and potentially weakened security devices, and make sure that not only are you locking down that network like Fort Knox and only allowing in exactly what is needed to allow that application or that IoT device to work, but you need to make sure that you're monitoring that traffic to look for anything suspicious. That way, if suddenly your webcam starts connecting out to Russia, it can raise some red flags that there might be something you need to look into. If we look on to our second major threat category we need to watch out for, that's account takeover. And this one has a bit of a long history too. Like, it's been several decades now where it feels like some executive at some big company said passwords are dead. And then there was a massive breach of 10 million, 20 million, 77 million passwords. And then another executive says, oh, passwords are dead. And then we have another breach of billions of passwords. And this cycle just continues on and on and on. One of my team's jobs is to monitor the dark web and underground forums for these password breaches to maintain our dark web scan tool. And man, it's like every single day there's another multi-million record dump showing up on here from another service. And these breaches are fueling these massive collections of cracked passwords now, where anyone can go online and get a copy of collections 1 through 5, which have 22 billion usernames and passwords in them for free. Like, you could imagine what a threat actor with a little bit of money and a little looser morals could probably get their hands on. And with these collections of usernames and passwords, threat actors are then taking them and attacking other services. They're using things like password spraying, where they'll take the top 1,000 most common passwords and try them against people's accounts. And you might think, oh, well, I've got account lockouts where if there's 5 failed attempts in a minute or so, it'll lock the account out. Well, threat actors are getting really good at getting around that now, where instead of trying 1,000 passwords against one account, they'll try one password against 1,000 accounts and then cycle through to the second password. So that by the time they're cycling through these accounts and trying additional passwords, they've already passed the window for where the lockout would occur. We're seeing attacks like credential stuffing now, where threat actors will take credentials from one service and try those exact same credentials against another service. I'm a pretty big nerd and pretty big into video games, and this is a really big issue in the video game space specifically, where a lot of people will sign up for Xbox Live and PlayStation Plus and Nintendo Online, and they tend to pick the exact same password and the exact same email with a lot of these services. So if one of them gets breached, or maybe a video game forum you visit gets breached, which is probably more likely, now those threat actors can take that credential and try it against a lot of other related services with pretty good success. Because it turns out people just aren't good at picking strong and unique passwords for each of their accounts. We're seeing actual malware payloads too, things like Mimikatz and Windows Credential Editor, where if they're able to get a foothold on your network, they can use these to steal passwords straight out of memory from Windows computers, or use them to launch pass-the-hash attacks against network-based resources as well. And now multi-factor authentication is one of, if not the best thing you can do to protect against this style of attack, but not all MFA is created equally. Like SMS-based, so text message-based MFA, is actually pretty easy to get past. A great example of this was the Reddit breach a few years ago, where a bunch of Reddit was using multi-factor authentication, but it was text-based MFA for their developers. A threat actor first got a hold of a bunch of valid credentials for some Reddit administrators and Reddit developers, and then they called up their telephone providers and convinced them to port over their numbers to a SIM card under the attacker's control, which then let them intercept those SMS-based multi-factor tokens and log straight in. Because it's actually really easy to social engineer that 18-year-old on the other end of T-Mobile's support line and convince them to port over a phone number. It's unfortunate, but it's true. We've seen credential stuffing attacks used in quite a few really big breaches too. It's really popular in the retail vertical, but attacks against Citrix, HSBC, State Farm were all because of credential stuffing. And in reality, like, it doesn't matter how many executives say passwords are dead, they're still going to be a top factor in 2020, 2021, and for quite some time into the future. This is backed up by other data too. One of the more recent Verizon data breach investigations report, they found that 70% of hacking-related breaches leveraged stolen credentials in 2019. And that number is right around the same for the following year as well. I mentioned that my team maintains our dark web scan tool, where as of my last check, we had somewhere right around 2.8 billion unique email accounts that we've been able to collect for free on underground forums in the dark web. And on top of that, around 600 million unique passwords that we've been able to collect across all of these breaches. And again, we have a really strict do not fund cyber criminals policy. This is stuff we've gotten for free. If we had $10 to throw at one of these breaches, or maybe a couple hundred for a brand new one, we could get a hold of credentials from breaches that people didn't even know were breached yet, which means they probably haven't reset their password. They probably haven't reset that password that they shared with other accounts. And it would let me go in and breach all their other accounts as well that they shared with that too. A good example of that was back in 2012. LinkedIn got breached to the tune of around 117 million records. And of those accounts that were stolen, one of them was associated with a Dropbox.com corporate email address. So a Dropbox employee had signed up for LinkedIn using their corporate email. Turns out that Dropbox employee used a pretty crummy password for their LinkedIn account, and the hacker was able to crack that password pretty quickly. It also turns out that that Dropbox employee reused that same password with their Dropbox corporate account as well. So the threat actor that breached LinkedIn was then able to use that access to breach Dropbox within a few weeks or so. And that's pretty much par for the course. When one of these big breaches happens before it even pops up online, the threat actors are going through looking for potentially useful credentials and then trying them against other services as well. Now let's move on to the third threat, and that is fileless malware. This one's a bit of a technical one, so I'll try and explain it in the easiest way possible. And I guess the first way to start is, how does it differ from traditional malware? So with traditional malware, all of the malicious code, the bad actions, everything bad in that payload is actually just a file saved onto your hard drive. That makes it actually pretty easy to detect. Even traditional endpoint protections are always scanning your hard drive, always scanning new file downloads as they come, running them through signatures or heuristic engines, and potentially catching these threats. And it also means that if you delete that file, you delete the malware infection and you're basically home free. With fileless malware, though, that file never touches the hard drive. It resides solely in memory. That makes it a lot more difficult to detect because there's nothing saved onto the storage of your computer for these endpoint agents to scan. Instead, they'll inject the malicious code into another process on your computer and run it from there. A lot of them leverage some of the tools that come built into our computers that administrators use every day, like PowerShell and other scripting engines. And it allows them to use these, what we call living off the land attacks, to stay hidden and do everything without having to drop a payload on the computer. Now, it is a little bit of a misnomer. Some of them do arrive with a file, usually in the form of an Office document as a dropper. But the difference between this and traditional malware is that as soon as you open that document and the macros run or whatever exploit they use launches, they don't care what happens to that file. They've already gained persistence in memory on your computer. They can gain reboot persistence through the Windows registry as well. And basically now they're relying solely in memory, which makes it significantly more difficult to detect. And these styles of threats have been around for quite some time. Memory resident viruses have been around since before I was born. In the early 2000s, we had things like SQL Slammer and Code Red. But these days, living off the land attacks are the most common form that we see. When it comes to the latest evolutions, we see a lot of DLL, so library and memory injection. Again, they'll use legitimate tools like PowerShell and NetSH, things that are built in that you can't necessarily block without a lot of potential collateral damage too. And we also see them attached to zero-day exploits now as well, where they'll go after a vulnerability in an application you use and then use that to compromise your system. They really started to pick up around 2016. I mentioned they're not always completely fileless. They often start with an Office document. But we actually saw PowerShell-based threats rose 460% in 2019. And if you remember a few slides ago, those script-based attacks actually rose 888% from 2019 to 2020. One example of that are attacks that leverage something called DDE, or Dynamic Data Execution. So if you're not familiar with it, if you've ever copied a Excel spreadsheet into a Microsoft Word document, if you update that spreadsheet, it'll also update the Word document. You've probably seen that. That's using this DDE protocol to facilitate that communication. It's pretty dang useful. But you can also use DDE to launch other applications. So in this case, command prompt, and then tell it to open another application, which in this case, just calculator.exe, but it could be something more serious as well. The reason threat actors are pivoting to this instead of just macro attacks is because with macro-based documents, when you open that thing up, you get that big yellow security ribbon at the top that says danger, security, alert, there's macros in this, are you sure you want to enable it? Even to the untrained individual, they'll typically see that and second guess it and think, oh, maybe I don't want to click that enable button. With DDE, though, you don't get that. You get this document contains links that may refer to other files. Do you want to update this document from data from those linked files? Like if I saw this and I had no idea what it was, I'd think, oh, well, Word just crapped out, but I want to open this, so sure, whatever, yes. And if you hit yes, it'll allow that DDE auto command to run. It could open up PowerShell with an embedded script and then go and download additional stages. And again, at that point, it's basically game over. So how do you defend against these threats? I mean, the good news is you can. There are plenty of tools and policies and behavioral changes and education you can do to set yourselves up for a fighting chance against these modern threat landscapes. When it comes to spear phishing, it boils down to multi-factor authentication to protect against those credentials being stolen, or I guess protect your accounts when those credentials do get stolen. But really, phishing awareness training is a massive part of this too. You're never going to get your click rate down to 0. But if you can get it down to the single digits from whatever it's at right now, you set a lot of your technical defenses up for a fighting chance against the ones that your users still fall victim to. Some of those technical defenses you should look into are things like DNS firewalling, services that will effectively neuter the links in phishing emails so that instead of going to whatever the original phish destination was, they get redirected to a safe black hole, maybe with some phishing awareness training baked right into it. So they can get some training in the moment after accidentally falling victim to one of these. When it comes to account takeover, multi-factor authentication is key. Like that way, even if someone accidentally gives up their username and password because of a phish, the threat actor still has to break into their house and steal their phone and maybe cut off their finger to get past the biometric lock on it before they're able to get into that account. And again, not all MFA is created equal. Look at ones that use push notifications because they arrive over an encrypted channel that you can't just SIM swap your way out of. SMS-based MFA is not secure enough. That said, if it's literally your only option, it's better than nothing. But if you have any other option than text-based multi-factor authentication, use those other options. Phishing awareness training comes in here as well because the majority of account compromises will come from a potential phish, just tricking your users into giving up their credentials willingly. But you also need advanced malware detection as well to catch those other threats like Mimikatz and Windows Credential Editor that might be lying and hiding on your computer and sniffing passwords straight out of memory there. When it comes to fileless malware, intrusion prevention systems can help block those exploits that they use to gain their first foothold in an application. But really, it boils down to layers of advanced malware detection to catch the additional payloads. And specifically, strong endpoint detection and response and endpoint protection agents that don't just look for files as they're saved to the hard drive and scan them through whatever their engine is, but also monitor the existing memory of already existing processes to look for potentially suspicious activity. Because these days, attackers can weaponize just about any process on your computer if they can trick you into running a PowerShell script, which means you need to watch that suspicious activity, not just in new files, but existing ones as well. And really, it boils down to a defense in depth. Like, there's no one single thing that you can set up or install or start doing that's going to keep you 100% safe from cyber attacks. Really, you need multiple layers so that if one of those evasive threats makes it through your signature-based detections, now you've got a sandbox-based anti-malware engine behind it to catch it as well. So I think we're running right up on time. I want to make sure that if anyone has any questions, please feel free to shoot them into that questions window that you have in the GoToWebinar control panel. I know sometimes you might be a little shy to ask them. My inbox and Twitter are always open for security questions as well. Same with LinkedIn, whatever that is for as well. And again, check out secplicity.org/the443 for our weekly podcast too, where we talk about the latest security news and the latest trends and try and break them down into really actionable, easily actionable advice as well too. So now I guess I'll hand it back to Pete and we'll see if there's any questions that come in.
That was awesome, Mark. A lot of great stuff in there. And I think the thing to really emphasize, right, is a lot of these modern hacking organizations are using multifaceted threats. So they're trying lots of things to get in, or they're going to do multiple things once they get in. And Emotet is a great example of that. They're stealing credentials, they're launching ransomware, they're exfiltrating data. It's not an attack, it's a myriad of attacks, right? And so you need all of these things. And this is an area where we can help you assimilate what are the layers that you have, what are the layers that you're missing, and what should you be doing to get your organization to the next level. So just a lot of great stuff in there. One hot tip from Pete Greco here. What I like to do on my home network with IoT devices is I put anything that I feel like could potentially be easy to exploit, or I don't know what data it might be trying to collect. I put it on my guest network, so it's segmented from my laptops where I actually have real data that I'm concerned about. So my Wemo switches, my Alexa, a whole bunch of devices I put in my guest network. That way they can't see my laptops where I actually have sensitive data. So take advantage. Train your users. That's going to help them at work. It's going to help them at home as well. And that goes a long way. So we don't have any questions we got a couple of thank yous for a great presentation. And I'm also going to thank Mark for a great presentation. I loved every second of that. Thanks so much for helping us out today, Mark. I really appreciate it. I hope we get you on another productive event in the future. And I want to thank all of our attendees for hopping on today. Those gift cards will be arriving in your inboxes shortly. We'll probably drop out a note on when you can expect those. If you have questions, want to learn more or hear more from Mark or his colleagues at Watchguard, reach out to your Productive rep. Either email them directly or help@productivecorp.com, and we'll get back to you as quick as we can. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Mark.
Awesome. Thank you so much.